we're talking a lot about psychedelics as mental health treatments. They're being studied for mental health treatment. So naturally, you start producing headlines about psychedelics being new, novel, rapid acting, robustly efficacious treatments for mental health. And all of a sudden, you're going to get a bunch of persons with mental health conditions and related sorts of medications that are very, very interested in this kind of work. So most of the time in the past, it's always been relatively healthy persons that aren't necessarily taking very many medications. But boy, it seems like it just kind of keeps ramping up as far as the persons that have mental health struggles that are taking psychiatric medications. So at this point in time, I think that it's almost like the floodgates have just opened, and lots and lots and lots of people with mental health conditions and medications are looking at this kind of modality with an open mind.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Psychedelic Conversations. Today, we have a returning guest, Dr. Benjamin Malcolm. Welcome. Pleasure to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Susan.
Thanks for making time in your busy life, as always, creating and teaching and educating. So I'd like our listeners to go back to the first episode we recorded. I think it was a year, maybe a bit longer ago. Since then, the landscape has changed a lot. I'm sure you're feeling this as well. There's a lot of intensity, a lot more questions have arisen, especially around in my community. And also the type of people that now coming and seeking the help from the psychedelic substances have changed. And I think let's blame it on Michael Pollan, the Netflix series, because a lot of people are now for the first time hearing it. And those are the kind of people who would never even consider it before. Now they are considering. So I see the landscape is changing. Lots of things are emerging, but at the same time, lots of misinformation is floating around. So for that reason, I just really wanted to come back and get back in touch with you, and also ask you specific questions about this drug interaction. So just to give a context to our listeners, I wanted to tell them who you are, and then we can dive into it. So you are a psychiatric pharmacist offering psychopharmacology. Those words are so complex, right? Let me try again. Psychiatric, it's like a riddle. Psychiatric pharmacist offering psychopharmacology, consulting and education relating to psychedelic pharmacology and their potential for interaction with psychiatric medication. Right. Thank you so much. Thank you. So, essentially you are a consultant and a psychedelic educator. So really excited to have you again. For our listeners, we will link the first episode in the show notes, but just a quick sort of background. What brings you to this work?
Yeah. Well, so it was all there, right? Like by training, I'm a psychiatric pharmacist, which means that I went to pharmacy school and got a doctorate of pharmacy. I did a couple of years of postgraduate residency training. So I did first in like a hospital, just acute care, general medicine sort of like practice. And I did a second in psychiatry or psychiatric pharmacy. So, and passed a board certification exam. So compared to like an average pharmacist, I have like advanced postdoctoral training, and then some of that training specializes specifically in psychiatry. So basically what that does is it makes me a person that knows a lot about traditional psychiatric medications and mental illnesses. But I would say like passion, inspiration, curiosity that really kind of led me down that educational pathway was an interest in psychoactives, and particularly psychedelic types of substances. So at this point in time, I function as a psychopharmacology consultant and psychedelic educator. So I'm focused on education relating to psychedelics, and then the psychopharmacology consulting is also focused on psychedelics. But a lot of the time, it's in a person that's taking traditional types of psychiatric medications or treatments. So I kind of offer myself as like an expertise bridge or like liaison between these kind of two worlds of traditional psychiatric medications and psychedelic therapy or psychedelic healing.
That's wonderful. And thank you so much for doing this work. I don't know many people who actually offer this specific, guidance that you do, or the education, or the consultancy. I think this is great what you're doing right now, especially.
I think right now it is a fairly unique type of offering. Like, I'm not aware of too many persons that are doing it. I do know like Dr. Emily Culpa. She's another pharmacist that does have like a page for consulting that's up. And then they don't necessarily offer consulting at this point in time, but recently in the last couple of years, there has been an organization formed, the Psychedelic Pharmacist Association. So there is more interest from pharmacists getting involved in this kind of area and helping to do this kind of, I would say, like drug-drug interaction and kind of like medical illness screening or consulting kind of work. Yeah.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And when I first met you, of course, I'm continually, I'm subscribed, so I'm continually receiving your content and your updates. And there was this template that I still use. It's brilliant, where you kind of listed, all the medicines, the classic psychedelics and their interaction, like the level, like psilocybin and ayahuasca. I think there's mescaline, there's a couple more. That chart was really helpful in itself. And I've never seen that done that way, done that way. So I think it's very helpful. And currently, being in the space that, I do what I do, I get a lot of, as I said, the landscape has changed. And I think we are seeing many people who's been on SSRIs for 10, 20, 30 years are now looking to taper off or at least come off their medication and then alternatively come into working with psychedelic substances in therapeutic settings. What are your thoughts on that? Do you see the same? It's kind of like we're moving into a different landscape currently.
Yeah. Well, we're talking a lot about psychedelics as mental health treatments. They're being studied for mental health treatment. So naturally, you start producing headlines about psychedelics being new, novel, rapid acting, and robustly efficacious treatments for mental health. And all of a sudden, you're going to get a bunch of persons with mental health conditions and related sorts of medications that are very, very interested in this kind of work. So, yeah, I would say that, it was happening even as early as like 2016 through 2018. That's about the time that I was starting my consulting practice. And it was like, that was kind of the story I would get from retreat centers or facilitators. Like, I've been doing this work for quite a while, and most of the time in the past, it's always been relatively healthy persons that aren't necessarily taking very many medications. But boy, it seems like it just kind of keeps ramping up as far as the persons that have mental health struggles that are taking psychiatric medications. So I don't know when Michael Pollan wrote the book, How to Change Your Mind. It was like 2017 or something that it came out. But yeah, this sort of like new wave where it's like been made into a Netflix documentary, I think has like truly like reached the masses, right? Like, unfortunately, more people watch TV and Netflix than read books these days. But yeah, he pollinated the peoples as far as like getting them to understand that there was a way of changing your mind or like kind of changing your approach maybe towards handling emotions that's possible through psychedelic experiences or psychedelic therapy that's just different than other sorts of treatments out there. So yeah, at this point in time, I think that it's almost like the floodgates have just opened, and lots of people with mental health conditions and medications are looking at this kind of modality with an open mind.
Yeah. It's like my favorite quote. What was the name of the guy that featured in also his show, he said, he dreams of a time where people will be open to using these substances, and these people, not wearing tie, what did he say? Dye t-shirts and like,
yeah.
right. And then, can't spell the word psychedelic, and it's accessible. I feel like we're kind of going into that phase now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's nothing wrong with tie-dye if that's your thing, right? But to think of like, you need to be wearing tie-dye as a prerequisite for being interested in psychedelics, I think that era is kind of officially passed.
I think so. And that's why I see the new influx of, new kind of people coming in. And they're normal people, normal meaning with normal lives, with corporate jobs, single moms, parents, just the Western sort of model of right? So now,
like it used to be like an obscure thing that wasn't really even considered a therapy. And then it was an alternative thing that there was some awareness around that might have some therapeutic potential. And now it's kind of like poised as, well, it's probably likely going to be approved as an actual therapy in the next few years. And even without that kind of like rubber stamp government approval as a therapy, the data has advanced to a point where most persons are believing that it's efficacious and safe enough. And at that point, it tracks the person in the average house. It's not an obscure alternative anymore. It's a household conversation about mental health and how a person can feel better and optimize themselves and just live a more fulfilling and purposeful kind of life, that they're just happier.
Yeah, exactly. So what are your thoughts on now coming into the real conversation of the interaction, the psychiatric medications and the interactions? What do we know so far? I'm still getting people like emailing saying, I've been told not to use any of these classic psychedelics because of SSRI.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts? Like that, you're the best person to speak to this, so would love to hear.
Well, like,
thoughts.
which one do you want to focus on? Which psychedelic do you want to focus on? Because I do think it just sort of depends upon which one you're talking about. So I got SSRIs as the class of drugs, but like which, or maybe you want to talk about a couple of them in that context.
Yeah. So antidepressants in general and benzodiazepines. I think benzos are the most tricky ones. I think a lot of people are more scared of tapering off those. Using psychedelics. So is there a danger using psychedelics? Let's say psilocybin, for example.
Yeah. So psilocybin containing mushrooms or truffles with antidepressants, I don't think it's like a toxic kind of combination. So I don't think the risk is severe adverse reactions. Things like serotonin syndrome or serotonin toxicity, seizures, like this stuff, I can't find reports about those things happening. And it also doesn't really make a lot of pharmacological sense to me that there would be that kind of risk, because psilocybin as a drug, it binds serotonin receptors, but it can only activate those receptors partially in reference to serotonin. So serotonin syndrome is actually it's kind of a misnomer. It's not really a constellation of signs and symptoms as much as a form of poisoning. It's just linked too much intrasynaptic serotonin. So really the only things that are going to cause a true serotonin toxicity or serotonin syndrome are things that increase intrasynaptic serotonin. Well, SSRIs do. They block the serotonin reuptake pump. That traps serotonin in the synapse. That increases intrasynaptic serotonin. But psilocybin binding serotonin receptors, that's not increasing intrasynaptic serotonin. And then on top, it's stimulating the receptor. It can give a serotonin signal, right? So you could still overdose. Not really, because it only partially stimulates that receptor. That's probably why psilocybin mushrooms don't have a lethally defined dose in humans. Because if it fully stimulated that receptor and acted almost one-to-one as far as being equivalent to serotonin, as far as like physiological activity, then there would be a dose of mushrooms that produces a serotonin toxicity, but that hasn't really been observed. So in my mind, I'm kind of thinking No, there's not really a pharmacologic basis to think that psilocybin mushrooms can cause serotonin toxicity by itself, or really in combination with other stuff that increases intrasynaptic serotonin. Perhaps with the exception is if you have so much of the other stuff that it leads to a serotonin toxicity in and of itself. But then that's not because psilocybin was in the mix. In some ways, you might actually predict that psilocybin would be protective against a serotonin toxicity, because if you look at, I mean, there's no antidote for serotonin syndrome, but one of the drugs that's sometimes used in management is cyproheptadine, which is a partial serotonin agonist, right? So it's sort of like, okay, it's not a psychoactive or psychedelic partial serotonin agonist, but essentially the mechanisms of psilocybin and the mechanisms of drugs that might be able to help a person that was actually experiencing serotonin syndrome are quite similar, to the point where I'm not thinking that it's like a toxic kind of combination. So I don't know, could a person maybe experience some more serotonergic side effects? I wouldn't rule that out of the realm of possibility. Things like some more upset stomach or a greater degree of anxiety or something like that. But none of that is really life-threatening. And all of that can be kind of part of the psilocybin experience in of itself. So we don't really have the level of information that can tell us whether there is this risk of more side effects, or whether, you know, that's just the way that psilocybin works anyway, whether the antidepressant was present or not. So what I can say fairly clearly is I'm not concerned about serious toxicity and adverse reactions. There might be some risk of more mild types of side effects or serotonergic things happening, but I think the biggest risk is actually diminished activity of the psychedelic, or the psychedelic not working as well as it should, which kind of leads us to this point of like, well, most of the time you hear persons that have been told that they need to or must taper off to use psilocybin. And sometimes they're of the impression that they need to taper off because of serious toxicity. That's false, as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I know. But the idea of like, well, maybe they should taper off to increase the efficacy of it, that has some level of merit, but the jury really still is out. And most of the data, or the current state of data, sort of suggests that maybe a third, 30% of people can actually have the psilocybin experience they want without having to stop their antidepressant. Probably a good half, maybe a little over half, feel that, yeah, their antidepressant does diminish the effects of psilocybin, but half of those persons can simply take a higher dose and still have the experience that they want. And then there's a group of people that'll take a higher dose and it's still a lackluster experience. And then a group of people that seems like almost no matter what dose of mushrooms they use, very little occurs, right? So it's almost like a 50-50 type of thing as far as the current state of research, where, you know, I think you said like there's a lot of like misinformation. That's true. There's also a lot of missing information here, right? So I'm kind of talking about, you know, this stuff has come out in the last couple of years since we had our last conversation, but it's still not 100% solid, like you're going to hang your hat on it all the time. But I'm sort of, of the opinion that, well, if I'm talking with a person and they're saying stuff like, every time I've tried tapering the antidepressant, it's been absolutely horrible. It's been debilitating. I've, gone into crisis or been very close to crisis. And then I'm interviewing them and they haven't made abrupt moves. They haven't done drastic tapers. Like, it sounds like they're kind of going down a taper pathway in a way that I would consider like appropriate as far as approaching it. And they're still having all of these kind of problems. And then they say something like, well, and I tried a microdose a couple of times and I didn't really like the way it made me feel, but I kind of felt like dizzy and nauseous for a couple hours. I'm kind of like, you're sensitive to psilocybin while taking your antidepressant is what I'm getting out of that. Is microdosing pleasant? Do you like it? Is that going to be a great practice for you? Probably not, based upon whatever experience that you had, right? But what I am getting is that there is a real signal for effect occurring, even at very small doses. And one thing I've never, ever, ever, ever been told is that a small dose of mushrooms worked for me and a large dose was a total dud. right? So I'm kind of thinking maybe it would be more practical for a person that's on antidepressants, that's really sitting on the fence, right? Like not the person that clearly wants to taper, that feels that tapering isn't going to be that difficult, that are just set on being off the antidepressant and trying psychedelics alternative. I think in that person, it's very easy to kind of be like, well, let's try to taper because that's what you want to do. That's what you feel like is feasible for you. Let's just do that, right? But the person that's sitting on the fence, it's like, in an ideal world, I wouldn't be taking any pharmaceuticals, but I have to acknowledge that this drug was helpful for me and it took me out of a very dark place. And I'm very scared of going back to that place, / I cannot afford to go back to that place in my life. And gosh, it would be nice if I could just do this without having to make that big several month kind of taper and transition and go through the turbulence of that. I think it makes a lot of sense to try some microdoses and maybe even slightly above the microdosing range, because microdosing is supposed to be sub-perceptual. So if nothing happens, then I feel like it's pretty inconclusive, to be honest. Because, I mean, you would expect nothing to happen from a sub-perceptual type of thing anyway. So with psilocybin mushrooms and the SSRI antidepressants, I really feel like the jury's out. I think that some persons, for whatever reason, have a more complete, like, neuroadaptive response to the antidepressants, which really dampens psychedelic experiences, which some persons only have a partial neuroadaptive response, or maybe don't really have much of a neuroadaptive response at all, and they stay pretty dang sensitive to psilocybin. That's it for now.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. It's very clear, and I'm glad that you shared all of this right now, because like I said, it's going to be great sort of education for those that are really afraid and scared, because I do get a lot of people increasingly like worried, because I'll be honest with you, Ben, some of these people are actually part of some of the research teams in some, right? These guys are part of, like, some of the research teams are saying that is dangerous, and there will be a serotonin syndrome. It might. So there is this. I don't know. Maybe they're trying to stay safe, be safe. How the studies and the research goes. It's incredibly expensive. They have to really be careful. And I'm guessing they're just trying
I
to
also
be
understand
safe.
too. Like let's say I was practicing as an underground practitioner, and I really want people to get better and to have a big experience. And then I've got this applicant that, in a lot of ways, they look like a good candidate, but they're on this drug that really might diminish effects. And they're telling me I can't really stop that drug, or I don't want to taper that drug. Do I really want to stick my neck out there and basically be doing something that is prohibited with somebody for a chance of it not working well, right? And what would be the ramifications of that? People are spending a lot of time and resources kind of putting these experiences together. And some people may be putting a lot of eggs in those kind of like baskets and banking on some kind of improvement in their mental health. So also, I really don't blame persons in a prohibition climate where there is a lot of missing information for just practicing conservatively overall, and just kind of saying that, maybe in 5 or 10 years where there's more information about this, and it's very, 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 very clear that this combination does not produce a toxicity, and it is clear that you have to taper to do this. Okay. Or you can combine it, like maybe then I'll be able to do it. But as of right now, it just doesn't really make sense for me to take on that level of liability when the answers are so like unclear overall. And I'll say Compass's phase 2B trial, the one that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, a single dose of psilocybin for, I think it was like a moderate to severe type of major depression, they had a signal for suicidality in the moderate and high dose psilocybin groups that did not show up in the 1 milligram active control kind of group. And it was something like 60 to 70% of persons had to taper either an antidepressant or an antipsychotic to be enrolled in the study. And the washout period that was required from the study was something like 2 to 4 weeks. Whereas the survey information from Johns Hopkins kind of suggests that 4 to 12 weeks might be necessary to restore the effects. So I do think you've got this kind of person maybe with a history of suicidality or severe depression, Maybe they're doing well when you talk to them about being enrolled in the trial and they're on their medication. Then you tell them you have to taper the medication for the study. God knows how they tapered those. That's not included in the manuscript, over what time frame they did it and things like that. Then you have an inadequate washout period. Then you dose them a single time and they have a lackluster experience or a lack of experience. And then in the few weeks after that, they decide to hurt themselves. So it's like there is risk for a person that's on an antidepressant that has a history of suicidality, that is really expecting a lot out of this single chance, right? Like part of their trial design, like maybe they really should have had a few experiences there. Maybe the kind of like one and done type of approach for the person that's coming off of medications where the first experience could be diminished. Maybe that is a very risky kind of approach overall, actually.
I would agree.
Exactly. It's like not clear what the optimal approach is. SSRIs, okay, that's a class of drugs that it's used to treat depression, PTSD, anxiety conditions, OCD, premenstrual dysphoric disorders, antidepressants and bipolar conditions, along with mood stabilizers, et cetera, et cetera. All of those conditions are slightly different. And then even within the conditions or symptom clusters, there's a lot to be desired as far as like what an individual is actually experiencing, what they're bringing to the table, right? So sometimes you've got the person that, you know, I got put on Lexapro after my second kid because I had this kind of bout of postpartum depression, and it's just been sort of set it and forget it through my general practitioner for 15 years. I've never been suicidal or unstable or gone to an inpatient psychiatric unit. Is it okay to taper off? It's like, okay, like let's give it a try. You know, it sounds like the dose is mild, the illness sounds mild, you know, it's managed through a GP. Managed being like it hasn't been touched in a long time or even asked about how it's going or anything like that. It's like it makes a lot of sense to like try and taper versus someone else that has been to the inpatient ward for, you know, trying to cut their wrists. And one time they had to go to the ICU because the bleeding was so severe. And it just so happens that a couple of those events have been in the context of trying to stop or change medication somehow. It becomes like, yeah, I don't, you know, for the person that the practitioner, the facilitator, like one of the first questions should just sort of be like, who am I wanting to help, and do I have the skill sets to actually support, and what's the severity of illness that is like the line in the sand for me, not necessarily if it's an SSRI or not an SSRI. Right, like making decisions based on just a drug regimen seems inadequate to me. I get a lot of questions like that. It's like, what about this list of drugs? It's like, oh, I looked it up. Plavix has no interaction with psychedelics. And it's like, true, but it's an antiplatelet used for someone that just had a stent put in their heart. Should we think about that? Like, probably, right? So there's drug interactions, right? And then there's drugs or surrogate markers for underlying illnesses, and those need considered as well.
Yeah, and this is a great point. Not just the antidepressants, but also other drugs that help other pathological symptoms, right? They are also drugs that have been taken. So I think focusing on just the antidepressants or psychotropics or psychiatric or even psychotic medications seems to be just kind of taking a lot of space and conversation. There are lots of people on
they deserve the most space in the conversation because the psychiatric ones, particularly the ones that work on like globally work on GABA, like the benzodiazepines, or ones that work on serotonin, like the SSRIs, the atypical antipsychotics, your buspirone, trazodone, mirtazapine, things like that. Like they probably do have the most clinically significant interaction potential with psychedelics and their surrogate markers for like underlying mental illness, and we're using it as a mental health treatment. So I think that does deserve like the lion's share of like the conversation. I guess what I'm saying is that there's so many other drugs that have zero interaction potential with psychedelics, but they might signify some kind of illness that needs considered.
Yeah, and this is great. And I'm glad you spoke to this and highlighted this. Coming from a trauma-informed background, you know, I always think of it as a container. Okay, what can we do? What the container can be, like how can we set this container, and then the support, the allies. You know, when somebody says to me, "Can I just use psilocybin to get off my SSRIs. I'm like, no, let's look at your ecosystem, your environment, your container. And then like there are lots of other things to consider before you can just even think of tapering off. So, right, what are your thoughts on that? Because I think, like you said, most studies and research, one-off chance to get into those studies, to have that one chance of the experience under guidance for the research actually can be detrimental for those people.
Yeah.
I think.
Like there's a huge amount of pressure, right, for it to work. And maybe we should like not put all our eggs in that basket, because you run like risk of like acute loss of hope. Like, this was the last treatment for me. I've tried everything. It failed. Like, but it's like, okay, it's a false conclusion. It's too early to conclude that. You tried it once. You're fresh off medications, potentially in some level of withdrawal, potentially still diminishing the effects of this intervention. So thinking of a series of psychedelic sessions is always the counseling that I have. And that's what's evidence-based. When you look at MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, they're doing 3 MDMA sessions in phase 3 trials instead of 2, which they did in phase 2 for a reason. And it's like that third session makes a massive difference for a lot of people. So kind of thinking of it not as a one and done type of thing, but kind of a path that I'm going to need to do a series of sessions, I think is helpful overall. And then also not conceiving of psychedelics as a replacement for the antidepressant. Like, can I just use psilocybin to get off my antidepressant? And it's kind of like, I wish I knew the supplement medication trick that you can use to kind of like just switch an antidepressant out for something else, where it's just a seamless transition. And I'd probably make $1 billion if I had that supplement, right? Like it would be massive if it existed. And there's some people that are interested in microdosing for that kind of a purpose. Usually my counseling around it is that there's not a whole lot that I'm aware of right now that's evidence-based that is going to replace a long, slow, careful taper of the antidepressant. Like, that is the off-ramp for you that's going to give you the best prognosis of living well off the antidepressant in the long term. Right? It's sort of just, if you want to not use it in the next 10 years, take an extra couple of months to try to like taper it. Don't do things rapidly, because you tend to get sort of a rebound or sort of yo-yo effect. And even if you get off the medication successfully, it seems that it sets the person up for a really difficult like 6 months like afterwards, has kind of been my observation around it. But maybe a person starts an antidepressant taper, maybe they get halfway off of it, and then I'm really starting to feel lower. The dark clouds are rolling in, or geez, I can feel the kind of like anxious energy kind of building within me. Or maybe there's actually some level of like neurological withdrawal. Like I feel like some kind of like fatigue, like myalgia, like muscle ache, or some paresthesias, or even some of the brain zap type of phenomena. I think it's reasonable at that point to try a microdose or two, to introduce it, because the person's in a position where they could really tell if the microdose is helpful for them, right? Because if we say, oh, you're going to taper your antidepressant, let's just start microdosing. It's kind of like, okay, well, if it's going well, you don't know if the microdose was needed. And if it's not going well, you don't know if it's not going well because the taper rate is too fast, or if there's something about the microdose that is actually not agreeing with the person, or kind of creating some of the issues and things that they're experiencing. So I don't have a lot of reservation against a person trying microdosing to see if it could be a tool that would help them complete a taper. But I like to start the taper first, counsel them. There's nothing that's going to take away the benefit of a long, slow, careful taper as far as living well off of it for a long time. And if you get to some place that, you're feeling a lot of challenge from the taper, maybe you do want to introduce microdosing at that point, because you're in a very good position to kind of tell, like, oh, okay, the dark clouds parted again. Okay, like there's something here, right? There's something about this that actually is helpful for me. Because really, there are parallel processes. You got two cooks in the kitchen, right? You're going down on one thing, you're introducing another thing, right? So typically, in my mind, it's kind of better to do one thing at a time, because then you've only got one variable and you're in a better position to understand like what's happening to me as you go.
Yeah.
But there is no like, we're just gonna whip the tablecloth out like a magician and give you a big dose of something and put something else under it, and it just no more antidepressant. I'm taking it for 10 years, no more antidepressant. It's sort of like
it doesn't work like that at all. And
it's like a baby weight. Like my analogy is like pregnancy. It's like it takes a woman like 10 months to gain that weight during pregnancy, and you better believe it, she wants to lose it in the 10 days after giving birth, but it's so unrealistic and uncompassionate and not kind. Right? It's kind of like, be kind to yourself in the antidepressant taper. You've been taking it for 10 years. You don't have to take 10 years to get off of it, but you really might want to budget 4 to 6 months instead of 1. Like,
absolutely. Yeah, totally get this. And thank you for speaking to this as well. We have a lot of anecdotal data. I do advise the microdosing initially, because anyone who's never worked with the psychedelic medicines, let's say psilocybin, I'm always like, be cautious jumping into the big doses, try the microdose, and seems to be working. A lot of people, we do have a lot of anecdotal data, as I said, from those people trying to taper off, at least get off their medication.
Well, as far as like a practical approach, right, it's kind of like if a person was like, can I use microdosing to help me taper my antidepressant? That's when I would be like, okay, let's start to taper and introduce the microdosing later. But if a person was like, do I need to taper my antidepressant to use psilocybin? It's like, I don't know, but let's try the microdosing before you start the taper, because if you start microdosing and all of a sudden you're sensitive and then some effect, it's like, we have our answer. You did not need to go down the taper path. So yeah, I'm not opposed to like microdosing while on a full dose of an antidepressant. I just think like the intention or purpose of it would be slightly different than a person that says, I want to use microdosing to taper.
Yeah. And of course, that's, obviously subject to revision. I'm only going by
subject to revision. Like
revision
this is
all the time. This could
is
change.
Just like, this is a logical thought process that I've had around it. It's not an evidence-based thing, right? It's just kind of like, okay, in the lack of evidence, what can we do that is still reasonably safe, that sounds like practical or like logical for somebody? But yeah, I admit, like, it's not something where, maybe it is, you do a round of microdosing, you feel so much better. That just makes tapering easier. You can make a hypothetical argument that holds some water there too. Yeah.
Exactly. And the reason I say, microdose first, but also then there is this phenomenon that happens that I have noticed with people on microdosing, which I call the basement decluttering, because my understanding as a trauma-informed therapist is the people are on antidepressants because there were a time in their lives they couldn't cope with overwhelm. Therefore, this helped them, right? This helped them cope with whatever this is. And it could be trauma related. It could be whatever it is that the body carries within, a memory, something. And what I noticed that even on a microdose level, sometimes those things come up, those materials come up, the unconscious material of processing emotions, suppression, all kinds of other things. And at first, they might feel that their anxiety is amplified. And I keep saying, breathe through it for a little while. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't try and fix it. Don't try and eliminate it. Just see how it feels. And then see if you can build some capacity around this. And then let's see again, review. And through this process, within a few weeks, their experience changes. And then the good feelings of the micro, because everybody wants to take the microdose and feel good immediately. But I'm always like, maybe not straight away. Maybe the first couple of weeks free, there is going to be, I don't know, basement decluttering, right? Maybe like stuff will come up. You might need to sit with it, which you may not like. So those are things that, come up. And that's what I call the container. I always think if you are, interested in tapering off, please make sure your container is set. and you have a good support, because
Yeah.
even in the tapering process, things might come up.
Yeah.
Right. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, a few thoughts, right? Is like, one, I'll say like, yeah, sometimes like stuff comes up with microdosing, and I think sometimes people can emotionally process it, and sometimes it's like it comes up and it's just stuck here. I've come across a few people like that, and sometimes when people are microdosing and stuff's coming up but it feels stuck, I'm actually more of the opinion like, I think that the psychedelic wants to perform some kind of energetic catharsis for you, and you're just vastly underdosed for that to like be a complete sort of like process. So it's bringing up, but it's not offering a resolution. It's not offering a catharsis, which is tends to be what I think happens in the higher dose, mystical experiences and energetic kind of psychosomatic catharsis. So that's one thought. The other thought is like when you say this around like, okay, well, you tried a few times and you can kind of like breathe through the emotion, and a few weeks later you start feeling better. I'm kind of like, wow, that just sounds exactly like the first month of starting an SSRI. It's like before it works, it's not going to work immediately. You're going to have to take it for a little while first, and before it gets better, there could be some transient difficulty with anxiety and nausea and things like that. So I'm not trying to say that it is the exact same thing per se, but I think it's just very interesting that in the world of psychedelics, we're sort of perceiving or like aware that, okay, there's some kind of like emotional processing effect here, or that we have a tolerance in the process for symptoms potentially worsening before they get better. Whereas that is really just seen in the context of SSRI therapy as side effects, right? Whereas, wow, you've got a small dose of a serotonergic psychedelic that's kind of subperceptual. You've got this other serotonergic drug that blocks the serotonin reuptake pump, and the process that we're describing sounds pretty dang similar in some sort of way. So yeah, I don't know. It's kind of like, okay, if we're going to adopt that ideology around microdosing of psychedelics, why is it not appropriate to adopt that ideology around a person starting an antidepressant? Like, why would the counseling there be like, oh, these are just side effects that you're going to have to like sludge through to like get better, versus, oh, this is an opportunity to interact with your anxiety in a different way. And, you could breathe through this, and there's something that you could learn about the way that you experience emotions and the way you respond to emotions through this kind of process. So I don't know, almost like whether that's a necessary part of it or not a necessary part of it and just kind of side effects. It's almost like, oh, maybe it's like relevant in some way, but I think it's mostly just kind of like, okay, the psychedelic path, obviously there's a little bit more of a, let's be emotionally intelligent. Like let's figure out how to respond and interact with emotions differently. Whereas the other path is just more like, okay, the chemical's causing some emotion, just buckle up and get through it, and then you're going to feel better at some other point. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I know it is. Like, this is something I talk about all the time. Yeah, absolutely interesting. And of course, with the psychedelic medicines or substances, I think there is definitely that inducing of, let's teach you how to be with your emotions, right? Can you contain a little bit more? Can you just go a little bit further in just growing that capacity within you? So there is always that. I mean, I've always experienced that within myself, being such a good at dissociating. I'm like the master of dissociation. So my own personal experience when I started working with medicines is always like, look, there is this. Like, would you like to just breathe through this for a little while and see what comes up? And then each time you do that, you just kind of be more resilient and be more resilient. Like, oh, okay, I get this. And then it starts to translate into your life and how you deal with challenges and people. And then you get it. You're like, of course, no wonder. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And then suddenly you start to less dissociate and less and less.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my experience.
Yeah, there's like a real, like in psychiatry, it just seems like negative affect and negative emotion is just viewed as pathology. And a lot of persons that are interacting with that system, when they come across anxiety, it's like, what can I do to get rid of this? Because I shouldn't be having this, is sort of like the approach, where it should be more like, well, I don't like this emotion. It's a negative emotion. I sure don't want to experience it all the time, but let me witness this emotion. Let me try to ask it some questions. Let me view it, instead of like the enemy that I have to like disband immediately, as more like a messenger with a clue that I've got to try to figure out. And sometimes it is figure outable because it's like a psychosocial type of thing. And then sometimes it really might be some kind of chemical anxiety, some kind of genetic type of thing, right? Like there's many reasons a person could experience anxiety, I guess, and maybe not all of them are really amenable to, I'll just say, mental health treatments, period, let alone, psychedelics specifically.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to learn, right? I think we're just kind of scratching the surface. I think what I love about psychedelic work, or the space itself, is just kind of teaching us a lot more of the emotional intelligence. It's teaching us a lot to ask questions that we probably wouldn't think of before. And all of this is a great education, to be honest, from a personal point of view. And now that this, we're experiencing the psychedelic renaissance, things are speeding up so fast. I feel like people are going to become more emotionally intelligent through this experience, which is kind of exciting. And what are your thoughts and your observations in the current wave and current phase of psychedelic renaissance? Let's jump to that.
Yeah, hard to predict. It's hard to, like, on the one hand, not that many people know about psychedelics yet. Like there are becoming more mainstream, like we've talked about, but still, I think the majority of households, it's like not really on the map or the radar, as far as like, maybe I'm thinking about that or reading about that or talking about that yet. So on the one hand, there's the potential for a lot more people to discover psychedelics and like kind of come to this area of work, I guess. On the other hand, that does seem to be like a little bit of a runaway hype train overall. And the climate, I think, is kind of reminiscent to like early cannabis reform, where there's just tons of cash flying around and all of these like small startups and, a lot of fervor in stocks and things like that. And a lot of those stocks have crashed already. And some of the companies that were out there as early leaders have been folding recently. And so in some ways, it's sort of like we're going to come to some kind of like equilibrium here where we're getting closer to the truth. I think anytime you come from like a place of demonization and prohibition, there's some positive data that comes out. The temptation is to like swing the pendulum like all the way other. It's like almost to like balance the level of demonization and prohibition that's happened. It's like we got to have like hype and enthusiasm and this is all light type of like thing, right? Whereas it's, it's somewhere in the middle. Like psychedelics have a light side, psychedelics have a dark side. How to change your mind. Okay, use psychedelics, but in what way are you going to change your mind? In a way that's therapeutically beneficial? Well, there's a method for that. I'm just going to change my mind in the wrong set and setting, or perhaps with the wrong actors in an appropriate set and setting. There's a real chance for traumatization or molding a person in a way that is not beneficial for them and creating codependence and on and on and on. There's a level of like suggestibility and vulnerability that comes with psychedelics and a lot of like real ethical concerns around it that I think is going to continue to kind of like play out. So I expect over the next like 15 or 20 years that we're going to continue to see an expansion of psychedelic use. We're going to continue to see a lot of legislative reform happening. And I'm also expecting that the kind of like science and opinion around psychedelics is going to mature a little bit to something that's, okay, it has risks, it has benefits. There's certain situations where it's like a home run. We absolutely should do it. There's certain situations where it's probably not ideal and maybe we need to avoid it in that person, or at least avoid it at this point in time and do some other things first. Yeah, that's kind of where I see things headed overall.
Yeah, great insights. How's it looking in Costa Rica where you are? There's
Stunning.
loads of, okay. What about the retreat settings? Still high demand on the retreat settings, and
I haven't really done much surveying of the on the ground situation of retreat centers in Costa Rica. I know there are several of them. I had one of them reach out recently that said they're having like some kind of summit coming up in June where I think they said that they were getting together something like 50 different ayahuasca retreat centers that are just in Costa Rica, right? So they're out there, right? How well they're all doing? Are they all growing? Or some of them struggling to find people? Like, I have no clue.
Yeah. Also, I know we're coming to the end of our conversation. Can we sort of just quickly touch on? I know we talked about the psilocybin being safe around the antidepressants and in terms of drug interaction. Would you say ayahuasca and, let's say, mescaline? I did see your chart, but I'd like to hear from you. Would you put them in the same category, or should there be a caution?
I wouldn't put ayahuasca in the same category at all because it's got monoamine oxidase inhibitors in it. And so, like I said, like serotonin toxicity, it's about mixing drugs that boost intrasynaptic serotonin. So SSRIs do, so do MAOIs. So that is actually like kind of a classic serotonin toxicity kind of combination. So I think those types of antidepressants with ayahuasca, it's a lot more clear that there is a potential for a real serious type of adverse reaction. And it's not this kind of thing where it's like, maybe it will still work and maybe we could try that and try a small dose to see if you're sensitive. And like all that stuff kind of goes out the window and you're kind of left with like taper or bust if you want to try ayahuasca. Mescaline, I would say, is like one of the most mysterious psychedelics out there, and that there hasn't been any good research that's been done on it since like the 70s overall. There's not a whole lot about mescaline in of itself that would make me think that it's incredibly dangerous with antidepressants, but there's just not very much information about it. I might be a little bit more concerned about peyote with antidepressants than San Pedro, mostly because my understanding is that peyote has probably 60 other phenethylamine types of alkaloids in it. So there may be just more botanical variability to it, perhaps, whereas San Pedro, I'm not aware of that many other alkaloids that are usually found in it besides mescaline. So yeah, that one's kind of like I don't know if it's again, it's sort of like I wouldn't predict it to be necessarily like really dangerous. Mescaline might not work as good. Like it might not work as good because mescaline's a phenethylamine, whereas psilocybin is a tryptamine. The other phenethylamine that's actually been studied with SSRIs is MDMA, and it seems that SSRIs greatly diminish the effects of MDMA. Mescaline, I don't know, it's more hallucinogenic than MDMA. It's categorized as a classic psychedelic, but it's the only one that it's a phenethylamine, yet it does display cross tolerance to classic psychedelics like psilocybin or LSD. Mescaline is mysterious in that if you take it orally, the blood concentrations of mescaline peak in about an hour, but you don't feel the peak of the experience till about hour 4. So there's like this real disconnect between blood levels and subjective effects, whereas the other psychedelics, the blood levels and subjective effects match very closely overall. So it might actually be that there's metabolites of mescaline that are psychedelic in and of themselves that we just haven't even really discovered yet that are producing some of that sort of experience. On the flip side, if you inject mescaline into someone, they start tripping out immediately. So mescaline in of itself must be a psychedelic as well. Mescaline's really interesting. Someone should study mescaline. If they're listening to this, you're in a position to like study something, and maybe you have a tolerance for studying a drug that might not be going into psychedelic assisted therapy. That's kind of my theory, is sort of like, well, LSD, it's like slightly long for the clinic, and it has like a lot of a stigmatized reputation around it as acid and things like that. So that's my idea of like why it's not getting quite as much study as MDMA or psilocybin assisted therapy. Whereas like mescaline, there's definitely like a lot of, I would say, like sticky cultural appropriation issues from both San Pedro and peyote, right? San Pedro, it's Wachuma. Like San Pedro is actually like a Christian adaptation of what Wachuma originally was for the persons. So there's a, because peyote is the sacrament of the Native American church, and it's protected in that way that, okay, I mean, we don't need to like borrow that to the clinic. So maybe it's like a cultural appropriation type of reason. And the other reason is just kind of like a real strong mescaline experience easily lasts 12 hours and sometimes like 18 hours, which is just, it's too long of a day for the therapist.
It is,
It's
absolutely.
another reason why I think mescaline doesn't get as much study as others.
Mm-hmm. You just touched on LSD. Do you think, you said LSD has the stigma around it, but also I feel like there's secretly quite a high interest in LSD as well.
I'm not saying that the interest is low. I'm just
Mm.
saying, like, if you're a company that's trying to make waves by bringing a psychedelic to the medical marketplace, are you going to pick the one that was demonized and got psychedelic research agenda shut down in the late 60s? Or maybe you pick something like psilocybin mushrooms that grows all over the place around the world, or maybe something like MDMA, a synthetic that came along in the late 70s or early 80s that sort of like, okay, it wasn't really involved in passing of the Controlled Substance Act and a need to overhaul the way that we regulate drugs in the United States and things of that nature. But is LSD medicinal, therapeutic, can do amazing things for people? Oh yeah, I bet my bottom dollar and give you like 5-1 odds, right? Yeah, it's
And what
fantastic
about
as
the
far as what it can do.
yeah.
Yeah.
What about the SSRI interaction or the antidepressant or any other drug interaction with LSD?
We don't really know, but for a lot of intents and purposes, I think of drug interactions with LSD as pretty similar to psilocybin, at least like in the brain or like on a pharmacodynamic type of angle. I think there might be more kinetic or like liver-based interactions that could happen with LSD relative to psilocybin, but it's not well studied.
Okay, brilliant. Wow, very enlightening. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Of course, always. I'll be on emailing you very soon as well, and 6 months down the line, like what's going on now? What is the latest? What is happening? But before we let you go, what type of clients do you have? Like, who do you help? And can our listeners get in touch with you? We'll have all your links in the show notes, of course. And your programs, you've got this incredible webinars. I'm getting a lot of notifications.
Yeah. So, my website is spiritpharmacist.com. I offer psychopharmacology consulting as well as psychedelic education. And I would say, like, I have the member resource and support program where these two things kind of like meet and overlap. So it's a subscription-based program that offers all of my courses in psychedelic pharmacology, webinars, written drug information guides. So you can buy each course separately if you want, a la carte, they're yours forever. But the membership, it's like renting my library of courses. So as long as you're on the subscription. So pretty good value. Just if you just want to join for a month or two and like binge my courses, you're going to save a lot of money compared to buying like each course separately. But then when the member program, there's also like a Q&A or like a drug information service. So maybe you have questions as an individual that's tapering or beginning to use psychedelics, or maybe you're a facilitator, provider, organization, retreat center that gets applicants that look kind of complicated sometimes, and you would like an extra set of eyes on them. The Q&A service is helpful for that. And if we can't get it sorted out through the Q&A service, then I also offer discounted rates on one-to-one consulting for persons in the member program. And if you are a facilitator, provider, organization, I'm happy for you to extend the member rates to your clientele. So it's like, basically, I work with all sorts of people, individuals, providers, organizations, and the member program is kind of our longitudinal vehicle. But you can consult a la carte, you can buy a course a la carte. I started offering these monthly sort of webinars. I've got Screening Essentials. That's coming up on April 22nd. Not sure if it will be on air with this episode before then or not. But if you're part of the member program, then I always post recordings to these things. Like basically any new resource guide material that I make just goes to the member program. So if you're part of that, you catch everything on replay, and I allow you to attend it live as well if you're in the member program. But if you just wanted to come to like one of the webinar workshops, that's fine too. You just register for it as a one-time kind of event. Yeah. I'll make sure that I have some, different links to, I would say like I have like lots of free guides and resources and things too. So I'll make sure I have some of those links for you in the show notes.
Brilliant. Sounds wonderful. Thank you so much. I mean, I feel really comfortable and confident in always recommending those that we also have in our community. I'm always, throwing your name around. Always check the spiritpharmacist.com, which is easy to find you online. So, and we'll add all those links in the show notes. And again, thank you so much, Ben. So lovely to have you.
Thank you, Susan. It's a pleasure being back in Psychedelic Conversations.
I know you're one of our favorite returning guests, so we'll be always having you as long as you carry on providing this level of education. Like we've not seen it anywhere else. That's probably why I'm always like stressing you, like hassling you, and always like, come on the show again. So yeah, that's great. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Hope you guys enjoyed this conversation. If you have any questions, anything you want to ask, drop it in the comments, or you can directly reach out to Ben, and then we'll have the links so you can join and look at he has incredible free resources that you can also look at and learn from. And that's it for now. I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye for now. Thank you so much for joining us. Psychedelic Conversations podcast is designed to educate, inform, and expand awareness. For more information, please head over to psychedelicconversations.com. You can also share with your friends or leave a review so that we can reach more people. You can also join us in our private Facebook group to keep the conversation going. This show is for information purposes only, and it is not intended to provide mental health or medical advice. Thanks for listening.